Hello and welcome to Generation 16, the series that showcases the history of Sega's Mega Drive. I'm your host, Greg Seward. Between its launch in late 1988 to the end of 1989, the Mega Drive library consisted of about 24 games worldwide. The system had failed to make a big splash in its native Japan, while in North America, the Genesis was only threatening to make a dent in Nintendo's iron grip on the market. 1990 would be the year where Sega started putting the pieces in place to build on its momentum, setting the stage for a massive push in 1991.
Here comes Duke Coke down on the inside.
Hurry up! Hurry up! Hurry up!
Oh, nice uppercut by Buster Douglas! Look at
The year started out slowly with only 2 games released in the first 2 months, but both represented exciting new arrivals to the Mega Drive. Publisher Messiah made its system debut in January with Sokoban, which was released in North America as Shove It! The Warehouse Game. It was the first of 8 puzzle games released on the Mega Drive in 1990, as Tetris Mania took hold the world over. Nihon Falcom arrived on the system in February with a Sega-published port of Sorcerian, the 5th game in its popular Dragon Slayer series of RPGs, featuring tunes from rising star Yuzo Koshiro. This game represented the first partnership between Sega and Falcom, which would grow into a more formal alliance in the coming years. Unfortunately, it never left Japan.
What about those Lakers, huh?
American ass, you've killed us.
The biggest debut in the first part of the year, though, had to be arcade juggernaut Taito, which released its first 2 Mega Drive games in March. The first was a port of The New Zealand Story, which was also the first arcade game to come home in 1990. This adorable platformer starring a kiwi bird trying to rescue her friends from an evil leopard seal looked and played extremely closely to the source material, but was different enough that Taito eventually ported the Mega Drive version back to the arcade as the New Zealand Story Plus. The other Taito game in March was the first boxing game on the system, Final Blow, another arcade port. Sega ultimately brought the game to the Genesis as James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing, yet another sports game on the system to get a celebrity athlete's name plastered on the front. Buster Douglas must have felt like quite a get for Sega. Douglas was the first man to ever knock out Mike Tyson, who was a de facto spokesperson for Nintendo and the NES thanks to Punch-Out! It's kind of ironic when you think about it. Tyson underestimated Douglas the same way Nintendo underestimated Sega and its Genesis. Let's not focus too much on how Douglas dropped the belt to Evander Holyfield less than a year later. Sega's Super Real Basketball hit the Mega Drive in March of 1990, and this game would also get a celebrity title in the form of Pat Riley Basketball in North America. I'm not sure anyone at the time expected sports gaming to take off the way it did on the Genesis, but it's interesting to see just how much the idea was taking root on the system in 1990. By far, the most active game genre on the Mega Drive and Genesis in 1990 was the shooter, and the tidal wave began in March with releases from Asmic, Messiah, and Dempa Microsoft. Asmic was another first-time publisher on the Mega Drive. Air Diver was a first-person shooter that immediately stirred memories of Sega's Afterburner, except with a giant cockpit interior covering most of the screen. Air Diver would have perhaps seemed more impressive had Afterburner 2 not hit the Mega Drive almost immediately afterward. This port of Sega's arcade mega hit was easily the most impressive of all the superscalar games to come to the 16-bit system thus far. Ironically, Sega itself did not develop or publish it. That honor went to Dempa Microsoft for some reason, the same company that more recently has been behind the FrameMeister upscalers so many retro gaming YouTubers and streamers have used for years. Afterburner 2 was also the first Mega Drive game to feature analog controls thanks to Microsoft's XE1AP controller. Rounding out the shooter contingent in March was another future classic, Assault Suit Lenus from Messiah. Also known as Target Earth in North America, this tough-as-nails shooter didn't make a big splash when it was released, but has since become very fondly remembered for its challenge and unique controls. It was also the first side-scrolling shooter to hit the console in 1990. The most important event in March of 1990, however, the event with the most far-reaching impact, was that Sega had finally decided on a character and team for what it had coined Project Million Seller, a game that would establish a mascot for Sega and its Mega Drive console, and be their first home game to sell 1 million copies. A character designed by Naoto Oshima would be inserted into a prototype by Yuji Naka. They would be joined by designer Hirokazu Yasuhara to create what Sega hoped would be a world-conquering game.
Pizza Dude's got 30 seconds.
Liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery with the Hubble Space Telescope.
The Warriors never seen nothing like this!
April saw the release of Phantasy Star 3: Generations of Doom, the second installment in as many years in Sega's flagship RPG series. This ambitious story that spanned generations featured branching paths, offering up much more replay value than your normal role-playing game. It even contained a pretty good story that eventually wound its way around to a connection with the previous games in the series. The relatively short development time, and perhaps the absence of series regulars Reiko Kodama and Yuji Naka, was painfully visible on the screen, however. Although it was extremely ambitious, Phantasy Star 3 ended up being a low point in the series, visually unimpressive, shockingly short for its massive reach, and just all-around disappointing. Sega got in on the shooter action this month as well by releasing a port of Data East's Darwin 4081. This one never came to North America, and it's not hard to tell why. While Darwin 4081 had an interesting power-up gimmick, where items dropped by enemies evolve your ship into different forms with different abilities, it didn't help add any excitement to this fairly lackluster vertical shooter. And considering the absolute bangers which were about to hit the Mega Drive in the coming months, Darwin easily got lost in the deluge. Another first in April was the release of the first digital novel for the Mega Drive. Moving Adventure Psyoblade from Sigma Enterprises was a port of a T&E Soft title released on the MSX and other Japanese computers in 1988. Psyoblade featured the story of a crew sent to intercept the Septimius II, a research vessel returning after a 28-year mission to explore a new solar system. Although it was never released in any form outside of Japan, happily there's now an English translation available via ROM hack.
Victory for Ayrton Senna!
I was an innkeeper in this crazy little town in Vermont.
Although May of 1990 was another relatively slow release month for the Mega Drive, it kept an important theme alive by introducing yet another first-time publisher to the system in the form of Kaneko. Originally an arcade developer for Taito, Kaneko began publishing its own games in arcades around 1989 and chose the roller-skating beat-em-up hybrid DJ Boy as its first appearance on Sega's 16-bit hardware. The brawler was still a pretty young genre on the system, so it didn't take much for DJ Boy to stand out. Luckily, the game received a bit of a facelift before it came out in North America in the form of excising some of the racist and homophobic imagery of the Japanese original. Sega, meanwhile, took another kick at the can by releasing its second shooter on the system in as many months, with Whip Rush. Developed by another newcomer to the system, Vic Tokai, Whip Rush was a wholly original game for the Mega Drive rather than an arcade port. It was a solid shooter that tends to get forgotten due to the relative quality of so many other shooters on the system in 1990, but it was a damn sight better than the previous month's Darwin 4081. It also happened to be the earliest shooter that was picked up and released in North America by the popular Renovation Products brand. The Mega Drive made its debut in South Korea as the Super Game Boy in May. Distributed by Samsung due to a ban on Japanese cultural imports after World War II, the system was renamed similarly to the Master System, which Samsung had previously badged the Game Boy. The Sega console line would quickly be rebranded as the Aladdin Boy, thanks to a series of computers being sold by Samsung under the same name.
I am Locutus of Borg.
Appearing for the first time on U.S. soil as a free man.
Get your ass to Mars.
Sega kicked things into a higher gear in June, releasing 3 games across multiple genres. Of course, there was at least one shooter. Twin Hawk represented a return to porting other developers' arcade games to its own system. This unique Toplan shooter featured landlocked enemies and a squadron-based attack system where the player's ship was constantly flanked by a flock of allied fighters, all of whom fired in unison and initiated a kamikaze attack if they were shot down. Sadly, Twin Hawk didn't officially make its way to North America, though it did get a localized release in Europe and the UK, the first Japanese game to do so without making an initial stop in the United States and Canada. Still licking its wounds over the loss of the Tetris license and subsequently being unable to sell its Mega Drive port and get in on the Tetris mania that was kicked off by the Game Boy in 1989, Sega launched its answer to the Soviet masterpiece in June with Columns, a color-matching game originally designed by American software engineer Jay Geertsen. Sega would get a lot of mileage out of Columns, releasing a series of arcade and home ports, as well as packing it in with the portable Game Gear console. Sega was focusing on all things American in June, it seems, as its 3rd game for the Mega Drive and Genesis this month was the first movie licensed game of the year, Ghostbusters. While Ghostbusters did feature a nod to Activision in the title screen, this action platformer featuring New York's favorite blue-collar spook hunters had nothing to do with the previous David Crane game. Ghostbusters was a fantastic early look at Sega's ability to overcome Alex Kidd's mediocrity and deliver on this all-important console genre. Sega's big month was capped off by the launch of Sega Visions, its answer to Nintendo Power in North America. This free quarterly magazine was born of Sega's previous newsletter and featured previews of upcoming games, interviews with first and third-party developers, and eventually game reviews, which were surprisingly harsh considering the magazine's position as a marketing tool for the console manufacturer. Sega Visions even started out with contributions from video game journalism trailblazers Arnie Katz, Joyce Worley, and Bill Kunkel. But that wasn't the biggest thing to happen to the Genesis in the West during June of 1990. This was also the month that Electronic Arts joined the family. Having reverse engineered the Genesis and won the right to produce its own games while paying a lower royalty rate to Sega, EA released its first 2 titles to the system. One was Populous, the pioneering God game from Peter Molyneux and Bullfrog Software, where the player took on the role of a deity trying to lead their people to victory over dozens of different worlds, both by directing them where to go and what to do, as well as using all manner of divine acts such as floods and earthquakes. There was nothing else like it on the Genesis at the time. EA's other launch game broke new ground as well. Budokan: The Martial Spirit was the first one-on-one fighting game to hit the system, a genre that would become massively popular in the coming years thanks to the likes of Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat. Unlike those future hits, however, the main goal of Budokan was to faithfully recreate fighting with a handful of different martial arts, and the resulting game wasn't necessarily bad, but it wasn't very exciting. While Electronic Arts was becoming the biggest third-party publisher on the system in America, the Mega Drive's original third-party publisher in Japan was busy releasing an all-time classic in the form of Technosoft's Thunder Force 3. This 3rd installment in the series discarded the overhead bits found in the previous game, instead concentrating entirely on one kick-ass side-scrolling level after another, featuring some incredible graphical effects and a fantastic soundtrack. Keeping the new publisher streak alive in June was Sunsoft, releasing its first Mega Drive game, Telltale Mahjong. This first ever online game for the Mega Drive was an odd one, considering the Mega Modem was delayed until October. Still, it was exciting to see online play beginning to become a thing on a home console. and fitting that Sunsoft released the first title to support the Mega Modem, considering its parent company, Sun Corporation, had partnered with Sega to produce the unit for the Mega Drive. Retrospectively, the biggest Mega Drive news out of Japan in June of 1990 was from the Tokyo Toy Show, where the first demo of Sega's Project Million Seller was shown on the show floor. This single level featured a blue hedgehog running across a meadow surrounded by mountains and palm trees, showing off just how fast the game could ultimately be. While the hope was that this game would eventually be Sega's answer to Nintendo's mighty Mario, no one could have known at the time just how much impact it would eventually have. Sega would continue to tease information about the game in its newsletter, Sega Player Enjoy Club, for the rest of the year.
Step by step.
In July of 1990, Sunsoft released its second game in as many months based on Tim Burton's Batman. Sunsoft had the license to produce games about the Caped Crusader across multiple consoles, and strangely enough, all of them ended up being completely different, from the platforming shooter on the Game Boy to the puzzle game on the PC Engine. While this Mega Drive version definitely followed the movie's plot more closely than the NES game, it wasn't quite as good. Still, it was well worth playing, and ended up becoming the poster child for the West's increasing unrest with Nintendo's restrictive licensing agreement in North America, which stated that third parties may not release similar games on the NES and competing consoles. Letter sections in gaming magazines at the time were filled with calls for Nintendo to ease these restrictions and let Sunsoft release Batman on the Genesis. Electronic Gaming Monthly even staged a contest to give away an import copy of the game. By the end of 1990, Nintendo had relented, and Batman was eventually allowed to make its way to the Genesis in North America. Sega's output in July featured 2 arcade games. The first was eSWAT, a port of its seemingly RoboCop-inspired shooter where a police officer donned a mechanized battlesuit in order to clean up the city. The transition from coin-op to console wasn't exactly perfect, but as with many home versions back in the day, managed to be a decent game in its own right. eSWAT was more of a rework of the arcade than a port. The second Sega title in July was a home version of Atari Games' Cyberball, a futuristic take on American football where the players were replaced by robots and the pigskin replaced by a bomb. It was a solid port and technically the first instance of American-style football on the system, though the science fiction setting was different enough that I don't think it really counts. More importantly, Cyberball marked the first time Sega released a game on the Mega Drive capable of online play, for use with the still-delayed Mega Modem. The American version of the game retained this feature in preparation for the eventually cancelled Telegenesis modem. Monthly additions to the Mega Drive family continued in July with the arrival of arcade juggernaut Namco. Although a major rival for Sega in the coin-op space, Namco had decided to throw its weight behind the Mega Drive after Nintendo had refused to give it special treatment over other Famicom publishers in spite of its status and early support of the system. Unsurprisingly, Namco's first outing on the Mega Drive was an arcade port, Phelios. This shooter, set in ancient Greece, featured the god Apollo and the winged horse Pegasus on a quest to rescue Artemis from the Titan Typhon. Bosses along the way included such ancient Greek monsters as Medusa, the Siren, and Cerberus. It was an extremely solid debut for the Mega Drive.
Pete Rose is going to jail.
To take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia.
I had a vision of love.
As the NFL preseason kicked off at the beginning of August, Sega got some bad news. It was about to waste the first year of its 5-year contract with defending Super Bowl champion quarterback Joe Montana. Developer Mediagenic revealed that it would not have the Genesis football game ready in time for the Christmas season. Master System and PC versions of the game did make it to market, though. Sega of America honcho Michael Katz attempted a Hail Mary by bringing in a new developer with only seconds left on the clock, but ultimately Montana's Genesis debut would be delayed until early 1991. Sega did manage to get a couple more arcade ports out on the Genesis in August, though. The first was Super Monaco GP. Much like Super Hang-On before it, Super Monaco GP on the Mega Drive featured not only the content found in the coin-op, but a whole new campaign mode, which saw the player race through 2 full seasons across multiple authentic F1 tracks. Even in spite of Joe Montana's delay, the Genesis Sports Library continued to get more respectable by the month. Sega's other release in August of 1990 was Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. And while there was an arcade version of the game, the two were nothing alike outside of the fact that you controlled the King of Pop and danced your way through legions of bad guys. Moonwalker was loosely based on the 1988 musical film of the same name, focusing particularly on the long-form video for the song Smooth Criminal. In it, Jackson played a magical being who saves 3 homeless children from Mr. Big, a criminal kingpin bent on addicting the world's children to drugs. It was a bizarre premise for a game, but it worked really well as an action platformer. The developers did an amazing job incorporating loads of Michael's signature dance moves into his jumps and attacks, and the first time you saw a whole screen full of henchmen dancing along with Jackson like something out of one of his videos, it was pretty damn impressive. Electronic Arts was back in August as well with their third release, a Genesis version of Will Harvey's Zany Golf. This continued EA's trend of porting Amiga games to the Genesis at an alarming rate, for better or worse. While it was great to see the Genesis library expand with God games and a mini-golf game, the quality so far wasn't necessarily the greatest. For example, the frame rate in Zany Golf was pretty horrendous. Electronic Arts would make up for this trend in a couple months. Over in Japan, the third-party output on the Mega Drive was pretty lackluster in August. Taito returned with another arcade game, Rastan Saga 2. This Conan the Barbarian-inspired hack-and-slash was impressive to look at with large characters and some gory visuals, but the gameplay just wasn't there. Rastan moved slowly and wasn't up to the challenge against even slightly quicker enemies, not to mention how clunky he controlled when jumping. It was a real shame, too, because the Master System version of the original Rastan was quite fondly remembered by those who played it. Sigma also returned with Shadow Blasters, a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up that felt reminiscent of Sega's Mystic Defender. The gimmick in Shadow Blasters was a solid one. The player controlled 4 different heroes whom they could swap between at will in order to take advantage of their particular powers in any given situation. The 4 characters also doubled as a life system, since each one became unavailable if they died, forcing the team to carry on without that particular member. But the action itself was boring, and so Shadow Blasters failed to stand out. Finally, there was August's Mega Drive debutante Unipac, which released its one and only Mega Drive game this month, XDR X Des Lyrae. This extremely mediocre side-scrolling shooter was one of the few released in 1990 that didn't eventually make it to Western markets, and it's not hard to see why. The game lacked any sort of excitement, it borrowed ideas from other, better shooters, but never managed to bring the whole thing together into something worth playing.
Funny like I'm a clown, I amuse you.
The New Kids Network!
The European Computer Trade Show held in London in September of 1990 gave UK gamers their first look at the oft-delayed PAL version of the Mega Drive, opening up a whole new market and enticing some very important developers to the console. It would see wider release later in 1990 through Virgin Mastertronic. In Japan, the shooters continued to come fast and furious on the Mega Drive, with 3 in this month from 3 different licensees. Hot B joined the Mega Drive family with a port of Taito's Insector X. This cutesy insect-themed arcade shoot-'em-up underwent a complete graphic overhaul on its way to the console. The visuals, the music, the bosses, everything but the general theme and some of the level layouts was changed. It's debatable whether these changes were for the better, since cutesy shooters wasn't really a crowded market on the Mega Drive, but the game was still pretty enjoyable overall. Taito itself stayed the course with Space Invaders 90, a modern remake of the game that put them on the map back in the late 70s. Although the basic formula remained the same in Space Invaders 90, Taito spiced things up with armored enemies, new formation types, fun power-ups, and uneven terrain that directly affected the angle of the player's projectiles. Even after over a decade, this classic premise remained as engrossing as ever. Messiah returned again with Hellfire, another arcade game coming home to the Mega Drive. This was one of developer Toplan's relatively rare side-scrolling shooters, and it featured an interesting gimmick that made it stand out. With the tap of a button, the player's projectiles would fire in different directions: forward, backward, vertically, and diagonally. The whole game required players to constantly switch directions, which ratcheted up the difficulty, but made this an extremely strategic shooter, not something you saw a lot of. Not all the arcade games on the Mega Drive were shooters this month. Namco released its version of Atari's coin-op puzzle game, Klax. Much like Sega with Columns, Atari had also been famously burned by the fight over the rights to Tetris, and so re-entered the puzzle genre with this unique color-matching game featuring tiles that could be thrown back up the conveyor belt, creative levels, and some pretty funny audio cues. Plus, it launched one of the earliest video game memes of all time, or whatever the equivalent of a meme was back in the 90s. But here's the weird bit. While Namco had released Klax on the Mega Drive in Japan, Atari Games itself was releasing it on the console in other parts of the world through its Tengen label. This port by the original arcade developers was done without any knowledge that the Namco version even existed. This version of Klax was more similar to its arcade counterpart overall, though I kind of like the audio a bit more on Namco's version. While Atari Games titles had been brought to the Genesis and the Mega Drive before now, this was Tengen's debut on the console as a publisher. Nothing but arcade ports in September on the Mega Drive, and we've saved the biggest for last. Sega's partnership with Capcom was already well established, with games like Forgotten Worlds and Ghouls and Ghosts, but Strider would be the center of a massive marketing push in the US. Even gamers who didn't follow the Genesis at all were probably aware that Strider was the first and only 8-meg game ever, as just about every magazine at the time featured a 2-page spread touting this fact, not to mention all the TV commercials. Strider on the Genesis was amazing, a near carbon copy of the hit arcade game that cut no corners and played like a dream. Sure, the Nintendo Entertainment System had a version of Strider as well, but it was a bit buggy and not based on the coin-op at all. Strider on the Genesis would go on to win Game of the Year honors from Electronic Gaming Monthly. A huge win for Sega.
1990 World Championship belongs to the Cincinnati Reds.
A day in which Germany became one country again.
Nevermore.
Why, you little...
While Sega only released one game for the Mega Drive in October, it still had a huge month as it joined the portable game system fight with the Game Gear in Japan. Basically a portable master system, the color screen and Sega's legacy for great arcade and home games made it an exciting alternative to the relatively underpowered Game Boy. If only it didn't chew through batteries at an alarming rate. History would prove that Sega bet on the wrong horse here, as the Game Boy went on to become one of the most successful systems of all time, but the Game Gear did manage to win the race for runner-up against NEC's Turbo Express and Atari's Lynx. Sega would release the Game Gear in North America in 1991. Much like September, Sega's lone Mega Drive game in October was a port of someone else's arcade game. Dynamite Duke was the third in a series of unique shooters from Saibu Kaihatsu. While a belt-scrolling shooter was nothing new, Dynamite Duke required players to move Duke around in order to avoid enemy fire, rather than simply shooting at enemy projectiles as they approached the camera. Duke also came with a full arsenal of punches and kicks in case an enemy combatant decided to get up close and personal. This was a solid port of the arcade game, though the fisticuffs were toned down a bit on the Mega Drive. Two other arcade games hit the Mega Drive in October. The first was from Taito, which at this point was the most prolific Mega Drive publisher in Japan other than Sega. Rainbow Islands Extra was the follow-up to the massively popular Bubble Bobble, where the player had to travel up a series of levels using rainbows, hopping from island to island fighting massive bosses. The Mega Drive version featured different worlds based on other Taito properties and a very cool power-up system where collecting different gems in the proper order would earn permanent upgrades. Namco was back in October as well with another of their coin-op games, Burning Force. This solid, into-the-screen 3D shooter felt very similar to Sega games like Space Harrier and Afterburner, with graphics that were comparable to its arcade origins. Sanritsu kept the new publisher streak alive with the release of Fat Man, a one-on-one fighting game from Activision, also known as Tongue of the Fat Man or Mondu's Fight Palace. Originally on the PC, this brawler tasked the player with working their way through an alien fighting tournament, buying upgrades, and ultimately taking on the titular Fat Man, or Mondu. The Mega Drive port excised the store and suffered a bit graphically, but otherwise played pretty much the same. This weird, mediocre port would come to the Genesis from Razorsoft, an American publisher which would become rather infamous later in the year. Sanritsu wasn't alone though, as Wolf Team also released their first Mega Drive game in October. FZ Senki Axis, which Renovation would release in the West as Final Zone, was the third in a trilogy of overhead shooters that started on Japanese computers, moved on to the PC Engine CD, and ultimately ended up on the Mega Drive. The PC Engine version was released in America as Final Zone, complete with hilariously abysmal voice acting and localization. This isometric shooter on the Genesis featured progressive damage to the player's mech, where various weapons systems would get knocked out over time. This, along with the relatively large character sprites and awkward angles, led to a pretty challenging game. October saw Sunsoft release its second Mega Modem game, bringing the grand total to 3 online-capable Mega Drive games on the market with no way to take advantage of the feature. Telltale Stadium was a baseball management sim where players set lineups and directed their athletes on the field. It's a bit of a shame it wasn't a more traditional baseball game, since it had nice graphics and probably would have done pretty well had Sunsoft brought it west.
320 pounds looks to be...
Word to your mother.
Sorry, Jack. Chucky's back.
Okay, there's a whole lot to get through here. November of 1990 was definitely a pivotal month for the Mega Drive and Sega. Early in November, the Mega Drive became the first video game console to offer online multiplayer thanks to the Mega Modem. Designed and produced by Sun Corporation, players could install the modem in the expansion port on the back of the Mega Drive and connect at a lightning-fast speed of 1200 bits per second. Finally able to take advantage of previously released games Cyberball, Telltale Mahjong, and Telltale Stadium. The modem even allowed for voice chat thanks to a small mic and speaker right in the unit. Logging into the MegaNet service would grant players access to a news service, and by buying various bits of software and accompanying hardware, they could get into online banking and even managing their insurance. But the coolest service available for the Mega Modem was the Sega Game Library. A pack-in for the more expensive SKU, the Game Library cartridge enabled players to download small games from the MegaNet service, the first of which was Putter Golf. Putter Golf was a simple mini-putt game that controlled a lot like Zany Golf, which was released on the Genesis earlier in the year. In fact, it played better, as the frame rate was much smoother than the previous Electronic Arts release. Another early Mega Modem game library title was Amiya no Boken, the first in a series of simple text adventures based on the protagonists of Phantasy Star 2, serving as prequels to give players each hero's backstory directly before they entered the plot of the original game. Amiya no Boken was followed up quickly by Shilka no Boken, based on the thief character from Phantasy Star 2. The first of these Mega Modem downloadable games to make its way to physical media was Labyrinth of Death, localized in North America as Fatal Labyrinth. This overhead dungeon crawler also happened to be the first roguelike game on the console, possibly on any game console. Gather loot and get as far as you can in the dungeon before almost inevitably dying, at which point you get a nice shot of your funeral with villagers gathered around your headstone based on how much you were worth when you bought the farm. Over in Australia, the PAL version of the Mega Drive was being released by Aussiesoft. Much like in the UK, the Master System had fared pretty well against the Nintendo Entertainment System in the land down under, and so the Mega Drive was pretty warmly received as well. And of course, Sega is pronounced Sega down there. In other Sega hardware news, American media outlets began running early details on the planned CD-ROM drive for the console this month, telling their readers it was coming to market in Japan in December of 1991. Meanwhile, Sega of America was reintroducing the country to the Master System. The Master System 2 was redesigned to be much smaller and released with an MSRP of $60, with most Master System games retailing for $30. Sega pushed the Master System 2 as a budget alternative to the Genesis, as it was releasing 8-bit versions of big Genesis games like Michael Jackson's Moonwalker and Pat Riley Basketball. It also floated the idea of buying a Master System 2 to keep at your relatives' homes, so you had a game console to play while you visited your grandparents over the holidays. Of course, you could buy a power-based converter for your Genesis back home, so all your Master System games were playable there too. Speaking of Americana, November 1990 saw Sega's first collaboration with Walt Disney Studios come to market in the form of The Castle of Illusion, starring Mickey Mouse. The first of a 3-game deal with the House of Mouse, Castle of Illusion set the bar incredibly high right out of the gate. Mickey was as adorable on the Genesis as he was in any animated feature, overflowing with personality thanks to wonderful animations, vibrant worlds, and solid platforming, which proved that Sega was more than capable of churning out the wonderful mascot-style games that were so important on home consoles at the time. Emiko Yamamoto received her first designer credit on Castle of Illusion, and would go on to design and direct subsequent games in the Disney Illusion series across the Mega Drive, Master System, and Game Gear. Her relationship with Disney would last decades, eventually becoming a producer at Disney Interactive on the Kingdom Hearts series. In hindsight, though, the bigger news coming out of Sega of America in November of 1990 was the arrival of Tom Kalinske. The Mattel and Matchbox veteran had been headhunted by none other than Japanese president and CEO Hayao Nakayama to take over as CEO of the American arm of the company and do whatever he could to gain ground in the US market. The Genesis had been doing well up to this point, but hadn't really put a significant dent in Nintendo's market share. As it turned out, another major game launch in November would help to do just that when Electronic Arts released the first console version of John Madden Football. Although the Genesis version wasn't the first game in the series, it was definitely the first one that made an impact, launching a massive franchise that would dominate the sports game sector in North America for decades to come. But this wasn't a port of Electronic Arts' original John Madden Football game for the Apple II. Instead, EA contracted development duties out to Park Place Productions, whose ABC Monday Night Football for home computers had really impressed a year earlier. Park Place managed to recapture the magic on this maiden Genesis outing, creating a supremely playable football game that retained enough realism to sate hardcore sports fans even without an NFL license. Two genres dominated 1990 on the Mega Drive, shooters and puzzle games, and in November, the system's third-party publishers were all in. Wolf Team released its second game in as many months with Granada, a free-roaming overhead tank shooter. It managed to be a lot more playable than their previous game, and way more interesting than the descriptor overhead tank shooter made it sound, thanks to a cool mix of levels that included everything from the concrete canyons of a big city to a giant airborne battle fortress. Not to mention large, interesting bosses that featured cool rotation effects and unique defenses that required interesting strategies to get around. Although plenty of its games had appeared on the Mega Drive up until this point, the port of the arcade shooter titled Same Same Same, known as Fire Shark outside of Japan, was the first game shooter developer Toplon would self-publish on the system. This arcade port was yet another solid shooter to hit the system this year, with great action punctuated by the impressive fire power-up, which led to flaming tendrils snaking all over the screen. Very cool. 4 puzzle games hit the Mega Drive in November of 1990, including 2 from a couple more rookie publishers on the system. American publisher Accolade decided to dip its toe in the Genesis waters with a console version of Ishido, The Way of Stones. This tile-matching game was unique on the system and offered a decent experience even if it felt a bit lacking in the presentation department. Like Electronic Arts before it, Accolade didn't want to pay Sega licensing fees to release games on the system. Unlike Electronic Arts, though, Accolade just went ahead and released Ishido unlicensed, complete with cardboard box and an oddly shaped cartridge, setting up a future court case between the publisher and Sega. Micronet made its debut with Junction, an extremely odd puzzle game that felt like a mix between a classic sliding puzzle and a marble maze, where the goal was to make a path for the marble to hit every curved piece around the borders of the screen within a time limit. Eagle-eyed gamers probably noticed the Konami copyright on the title screen. Junction is a loose port of a Konami arcade game called Kubrick, making Junction technically the first time a Konami game appeared on the Mega Drive. Messiah was back in November as well with Trampoline Terror, an action puzzler that strangely enough never got a release in Japan. Released by DreamWorks in North America, no, not that DreamWorks, players tackled levels built of trampolines which would eventually break if they were jumped on one too many times. It was a nice mix of puzzle and action, and it's a shame that Trampoline Terror kind of came and went with little to no fanfare. Finally, Namco continued its monthly Mega Drive releases in November with Mega Panel. This tile-matching game, which almost felt like a prototype of Panel de Pon, also known as Tetris Attack, was the first Mega Drive game from Namco that wasn't simply a port of one of its arcade games. Here, tiles slowly filled a well while the player tried to match at least 3 tiles at a time, making them disappear. Mega Panel never got a release outside of Japan, unfortunately, though I think it had potential to do well during the Tetris mania that was gripping the whole world. It was better than Columns at the very least.
There's the handshake we've all been waiting for.
And the trap is set. Here comes the net.
November 1990 was definitely the most important month for the Mega Drive since its launch in 1988. So many pieces were moving into place, especially in North America, that it's not hard to tell critical mass was fast approaching. And while November was also the biggest month in the history of the console when it came to game releases, December eclipsed it, with 22 games total hitting the hardware. But before we get into all that though, the Mega Drive was released in yet another region this month. This time it was Brazil, courtesy of Tectoy. Tectoy had released the Master System a year prior, and it was already building a faithful Sega following in the country through fantastic customer service and buyer perks. Not happy to simply repackage every Mega Drive game from other parts of the globe, Tectoy created a few of its own original games as well as being instrumental in getting Sega to partner with the mega popular F1 driver, Ayrton Senna, for the sequel to Super Monaco GP. Tectoy would go on to sell updates to the Master System and Mega Drive in the region well into the next century. It would also take existing games and reskin them with local licenses, such as Monaco's Gang and Sapo Zule. Sapo Zule was a reskin of Vic Tokai's Psycho Fox. Vic Tokai eventually remade Psycho Fox and Kid Kool on the NES once more and released it as their second Mega Drive game in December of 1990, Magical Hat no Batory Turbo Daiboken. Based on Studio Pierrot's Magical Hat anime from the same year, this mascot platformer featured multiple ways for Hat to attack his enemies, with jumps, punches, and the ability to fire his little pal Robogoo into danger. When Sega brought Magical Hat to the States, it received yet another massive visual overhaul, becoming Decap Attack starring Chuck D. Head. The gameplay was exactly the same, the level design was generally similar to the original, and the music was completely different. Another important Mega Drive debutante appeared this month as well. Game Arts published Gambler Jiko Chushinha, a mahjong game based on Masayuki Katayama's manga series of the same name. I'm no expert, but this seemed to be the best mahjong game on the system thus far, though not necessarily the weirdest. I guess folks loved strange anime characters and dramatic storylines to go along with their mahjong. December of 1990 also saw the return of Asmic with the very first wrestling game for the Mega Drive, Cutie Suzuki no Ringside Angel. Looking at this game through the eyes of someone who grew up in Canada in the 80s, an all-female wrestling game feels weird in an era where North American wrestling games barely ever featured a single woman on the roster. As wrestling games go, Cutie Suzuki was okay, but nothing special. It did feature some pretty decent graphics though, and some nice visual gags, especially the commentators who looked like famous characters. Speaking of sports, Electronic Arts set another precedent in December of 1990. After introducing the massively popular Madden football in November, EA showed that it was possible to do basketball right on the Genesis as well, with Lakers vs. Celtics and the NBA playoffs. It just blew Pat Riley basketball out of the water, with a much better looking and better playing game. Not to mention featuring real professional teams from the NBA. Not even Madden football had a pro license. In another case of no one knew it at the time, Lakers vs. Celtics was the first appearance of the EASN logo in an Electronic Arts sports game. EA would spread this across all its future sports games, lending a more authentic broadcast feel to subsequent titles. ESPN would eventually force EA to drop the similar-sounding moniker. It would evolve into the EA Sports brand, and the rest is history. Outside of sports games, Electronic Arts continued to release ports of Amiga titles on the Genesis in December of 1990, including Sword of Sodan. Clearly meant to capitalize on the popularity of Golden Axe, which had hit the system in 1989, Sword of Sodan wasn't a great game. But it sure was gory, something that our next game took to a greater extreme. Razorsoft's Techno-Cop was another Amiga port. This ultra-violent mix of driving and shooting was originally released by Canadian studio Grey Matter. Here, players take on bad guys in a near-future dystopia where cops are authorized to use deadly force on even the most low-level criminals. Hits resulted in enemies exploding into scarlet clouds of blood, reduced to gory, twitching piles of body parts. The game wasn't great, but it made an impact. Magazine and newspaper articles at the time started to ask if games were getting too violent, a sentiment that would come to a head a few years later when game makers found themselves testifying in front of the US Congress and adopting a universal rating system. Meanwhile, in Japan, Sega continued to release games for its Mega Modem download service. December saw the latest Phantasy Star 2 text adventure, this time starring Kane in his quest to become an engineer. Except he basically destroyed everything he tried to fix. It was a pretty funny way to explain why Kane was so great at destroying robotic enemies in Phantasy Star 2. Flicky was the other game to come to the Mega Modem download service in December, the first example of a classic Sega arcade game as a downloadable title. This family-friendly coin-op originally aimed to appeal to the larger female audience showing up in arcades thanks to games like Pac-Man and Mappy in the early 80s. It was also the second game from the Toshokan service that Sega of America decided was worth putting on a cartridge and releasing in North America at a discounted price. Sega's main focus in December seemed to be bringing the arcade home. This month also saw the launch of Crackdown, the first System 24 game to come to the Mega Drive. This overhead shooter offered a rudimentary cover system and tasked players with setting a series of bombs in each level and then escaping before they exploded. The game was ported by Hot B, and reportedly Sega was so underwhelmed by the result that it didn't get an American release until third-party publisher Sage's Creation added it to their library. Shadow Dancer also found its way to the Mega Drive from Sega. This made things a bit confusing since Shadow Dancer was the original arcade sequel to Shinobi, but Sega's home console already had its own sequel in the form of Revenge of Shinobi. But no matter, this arcade port was fantastic. Another example of home developers enhancing a game to take advantage of the hardware rather than trying to make a carbon copy of the coin-op. It had one amazing soundtrack too. Tengen was back in December as well. Its follow-up to Klax was a much more ambitious game, an attempt to bring Atari's fully 3D driving simulator, Hard Drivin', to the home. This game was considered state-of-the-art in arcades at the time, definitely well beyond what anybody could reasonably expect a $200 home console to match. And while it didn't really come close, the result was actually kind of impressive. Yes, the frame rate was pretty low, but it was amazing to see the Genesis pushing all these polygons around years before any of us had a clue what a Super FX chip was. Masaya and developer Arsys Software were up to something similar in Japan with Star Cruiser. This fully 3D space shooter / role-playing game featured a first-person perspective both on foot and in space. Players traveled around various space stations, talking with NPCs, jumped into corridor shooter levels, and then went dogfighting in 0G, all on the humble Mega Drive. So cool. Star Cruiser was just one of 11 shooters to come to the Mega Drive in December of 1990. Traco made its debut with a version of Atomic Robo-Kid, an arcade shooter originally from UPL that allowed players to move freely around each level rather than forced scrolling. It made for a bit of an awkward game to control, but pretty unique too. Robo-Kid could swap between multiple weapons on the fly in order to deal with the various situations he found himself in, and multiple paths through levels offered up a bit more replay value than normal. Technosoft returned with another very unique shooter in December, Elemental Master. Rather than jumping into the cockpit of a spaceship bristling with guns, here players controlled a human with the ability to shoot both up and down. But since he was on foot, it gave the game a whole different flavor from what we were used to from Technosoft. The game was relatively short, with only 5 levels, but came complete with lengthy cutscenes sprinkled throughout. Elemental Master represented one of the earliest examples of something that would become more and more common as the 90s wore on. The big third-party publishers were out in force in December. Electronic Arts joined the shooter crowd with another Danish Amiga port. Battle Squadron was a highly regarded multiplayer vertical shooter on the Commodore computer that should have been a hit on the Genesis. Unfortunately, the game was brutally difficult, and not in a play a lot and you'll get better sort of way. Rather, the difficulty came from every single enemy on screen taking massive amounts of damage to destroy. Even the little ships that housed power-ups were monstrously tough. Darius 2 was Taito's Mega Drive's sole offering in December of 1990. Renamed Sagaya in North America, this attempt to bring the impressive multiplayer, multi-screen arcade game home felt a bit flat, even though it was still fun to play. Honestly, Darius games that aren't 2 or 3 screens wide just don't feel right. Sagaya did have the branching paths and multiple endings of the arcade game though, and both pilots were available, though selecting one or the other basically altered the game's difficulty. Namco also released a port of an arcade shooter in December, Dangerous Seed. It featured a cool idea where the player could eventually combine 3 ships, each with its own weapon, into a kind of all-conquering craft, but for some reason the game just never felt very exciting, even with that interesting premise. While we're talking about mediocre games in December of 1990, let's take a look at Toho's first and only outing on the Mega Drive. Heavy Unit Mega Drive Special is yet another arcade port. The original was actually released by Taito, which had thrown its full support behind the Mega Drive at this point. You have to wonder if their decision not to bring the game to the console should have been a warning. Heavy Unit featured a transformable fighter, though the player wasn't in control of when the ship took on robot form. That was based on collecting a specific power-up. Fighter form was fast and weak, while mech form was slow and powerful. Sega released its own transformable mech shooter in December as well, with Aeroflash. Honestly, it was nothing special either, though it was better than Heavy Unit. Aeroflash was an original game where the player actually did control when they transformed. Jet form was smaller and fired a massive special weapon. Robot form presented enemies with a bigger target and gave the player the ability to surround the ship with an invincible barrier, allowing them to charge at enemies. The game felt like a spiritual successor to Sega's Astro Flash on the Master System. Sega's other contribution to the great Mega Drive shooter tidal wave of December 1990 was a port of Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair, not to be confused with Wonder Boy 3 Dragon's Trap, which was a completely different game. Like Elemental Master, Wonder Boy 3 was one of the few shooters during the year that allowed players to control something other than a spaceship. The only thing it really had in common with previous Wonder Boy games was that it was a completely different genre than the first two. The Wonder Boy platforming action was still there, but now as part of a forced-scrolling horizontal shooter where 2 players could team up. It was a weird but enjoyable arcade port that managed to retain its multiplayer mode on the trip to a home console, not a feature that usually survived. We've saved the 2 biggest, baddest shooters of the month for last, and arguably the 2 best shooters of the year, though Thunder Force 3 might have something to say about that. The first of these 2 is Gaiaris, the first Mega Drive game from Nihon Telenet. Released by Renovation Game, not to be confused with Renovation Products, which published the game in North America, Gaiaris was a fast-paced, supremely challenging horizontal shooter that featured a unique power-up system. Rather than collecting items dropped by enemies or housed in special containers, players could launch a companion fighter at enemies. If done correctly, it would latch on and acquire that ship's weapon. While this was happening, the player was unable to fire, helplessly avoiding danger while waiting to power up. Gaiares was an all-time great on the system. But probably more well-known was Compile's first shooter on the Mega Drive, Musha Alesta, aka Musha in North America. This Toplan-published masterpiece combined anime-style giant robots with ancient Japanese art design in a way that really resonated, making this another all-time classic shooter for the system. Although Musha had a standard weapon power-up system, it also gave the player the ability to collect different types of secondary weapons, which tended to make all the difference in most situations. Musha wasn't the first Alesta game to make its way west from Japan, but it was definitely the most important. It would go on to become one of the most sought-after collectible games in the Genesis library. Yes, the Genesis really hit it big with the release of Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991, but it can't be overstated just how important 1990 was for the console. The Mega Drive entered important international markets. It saw over 20 new publishers, including heavy hitters like Namco, Atari, Taito, and Electronic Arts. It had begun to establish itself as the home for sports games and great shooters, two genres that would prove exceedingly important in the coming years. And amazing ports like Strider showed that it was capable of closing the gap between the home and arcades. Electronic Gaming Monthly called Sega one of the most promising companies of the year, awarded the Genesis Console of the Year, while giving Strider Game of the Year and Super Monaco GP Sports Game of the Year. The tide was rising, and it was a super exciting time to own a Genesis. And that'll do it for this episode of Generation 16. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe, and consider supporting me at patreon.com/Greg Seward. Join me next time when I'll be talking about the third and final Mega LD launch game for the Pioneer Laser Active, I Will, The Story of London. See you then.